of the adrenal gland. Okay, it is defined as the central portion of the adrenal gland. So in the year 1932, an American professor named Walter Cannon proposed the fight or flight hypothesis. This fight or flight hypothesis states that the adrenal medulla is very important because it aids in combating situations of extreme stress. So Walter Cannon, the year 1932, proposed the fight or flight hypothesis. So he proposed a fight or flight model. So one of the earliest models of stress was developed by Walter Cannon, which is known as the fight or flight model. And this suggested that external threats will elicit the fight or flight response, increasing the activity, rate, and arousal. So these physiological changes enable the individual either to escape from the source of stress or fight. So from the term itself, the fight or flight. So when the individual is exposed to a certain type of stress, or a certain type of stimuli, the individual could either react by fighting to that particular stress, or the individual could either do the flight response. So the individual could either go away, or avoid the particular stimuli, that particular stressor, or the individual could either fight to be able to overcome that particular stressor. So Walter Cannon defines stress as a response to external stressors that is predominantly seen as physiological in nature. So the Walter Cannon proposed this fight or flight model, wherein we have here a threatening event. So we have here a threatening event. So when a threatening event will be perceived by the individual, that threatening event will serve as a stimuli, and that threatening event will serve as a stressor, and that will be processed by the autonomic nervous system. The portion or the branch of the autonomic nervous system that will be responsible for that particular stimuli is the sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system. So when the sympathetic nervous system in the central nervous system will be able to perceive the particular threatening event, then the brain will process that information, and neurotransmitters or hormones will be transmitted through the nerves, and it will travel to the ganglia towards the adrenal gland, particularly the adrenal medulla, and the adrenal medulla will be able to release certain type of hormone or a certain type of a chemical or a neurotransmitter. And this particular hormone, which is known as epinephrine and norepinephrine, they are also known as stress hormones. They will induce certain type of activities to different organs, such as the heart. So for example, in the heart, it will act on the receptors in the heart to increase the heart rate, to increase the blood flow. Will also act on the lungs to increase respiration, and it will also act on the muscle to increase the muscle strength. So in this way, when these organs will be activated, The energy will be mobilized and it will prepare the individual for vigorous muscle activity. So that vigorous muscle activity could be the fight or flight response to that particular threatening event. So the individual could either avoid that particular threatening event, or the individual could either face or fight that particular threatening event. So that is how we interpret the term fight or flight mechanism. And that is under the sympathetic nervous system. So the main hormone that is produced by the adrenal medulla is the epinephrine. So the term epinephrine was coined by John Abel in the year 1898, and he used this to label the active ingredient obtained from the extracts of the adrenal glands. So the epinephrine was coined according to its anatomical location. So as we all know, the adrenal gland is located above the kidney. So the term is uh, epi. Epi means above the kidney, and nephros is also known as the Greek for kidney. So that when you combine the two, the John Abel was able to coin the term epinephrine. Epinephrine became the first hormone to be isolated in the year 1898, and that is through John Abel. And it was crystallized by the scientists Takamen and Aldrich in the year 1901 and synthesized by Stolz in the year 1904. Aside from epinephrine, the adrenal medulla also produces the hormone norepinephrine. So the epinephrine um, it can also be abbreviated as EPI, and norepinephrine can also be abbreviated as NE. And they are considered to be the mediators, the major mediators of the postganglionic activity of the sympathetic nervous system. So most of the NE or the norepinephrine that is found in the plasma originates from the adrenal medulla. So I know that you have already discussed this on your previous topics, on your uh, autonomic from autonomic pharmacology. But let's just have some refresher about this topic. So epinephrine is the major catecholamine or catecholamine secreted by the adrenal medulla of most mammals, except for whales, chickens, and all fetal tissues, which were in the predominant catecholamine for this species and for these tissues is the norepinephrine. So epinephrine is also known as adrenaline. And this is a medication and a hormone. And as a medication, it is used to treat a number of conditions, including anaphylaxis. So epinephrine is considered to be the drug of choice for anaphylaxis. It can also be used for cardiac arrest, asthma, and superficial bleeding. It may also be used for asthma when other treatments are not effective. So it can be given by IV, IM, by inhalation, SC, or by nebulization. So as a review of our autonomic nervous system, we have here the organization of the autonomic nervous system. So, of course, when we say autonomic nervous system, that will either be sympathetic or parasympathetic nervous system. For the sympathetic nervous system, as you can see in the figure, we have here the involvement of our preganglionic nerve or preganglionic neuron and our postganglionic neuron. And this neuron are responsible for the production or for the secretion of certain chemicals that are known as neurotransmitters. So for example, in the case of the preganglionic neuron of the sympathetic nervous system, it will release ACH or acetylcholine to act on the um, nicotinic receptors on the ganglia. For the postganglionic neuron or the postganglionic nerve of the sympathetic nervous system, it is responsible for the secretion of the hormone norepinephrine or NE, and it will act on its target tissue. So in this case, the target tissue of this nerve is the muscle, smooth muscles and the glands. So within the glands, now you can see here different types of receptors. And these are the receptors where norepinephrine will bind in order to produce its biologic activity. So it is said that for the postganglionic neuron of the sympathetic nervous system, it always releases the hormone or the neurotransmitter norepinephrine, with the exception of the postganglionic neuron that innervates the sweat glands, because at this type of tissue, the sympathetic nervous system will release the hormone or the neurotransmitter acetylcholine to act on muscarinic receptors. So in this figure, the N refers to the receptor, that is the nicotinic receptor, and the M here represents the muscarinic receptors. In this case, for the receptors for the neurotransmitter or the hormone norepinephrine, these receptors here are also known as, ano gani yung tawag natin dito sa mga receptors na ito that are found in this smooth muscle as well as in the glands. The collective term for these receptors anong tawag natin doon sa mga receptors na yun that can be found on the smooth muscle and the glands where norepinephrine and epinephrine will bind in order to produce its biologic activity. Anong tawag natin doon? Hindi, dito sa smooth muscle as well as the glands, we have here 4 types of receptors. Kita naman nyo sa figure, we have the postganglionic neuron or the postsynaptic nerve. Ang postganglionic neuron, tinatawag din natin siyang postsynaptic neuron or postsynaptic nerve. And it will secrete yung ating norepinephrine. Tapos yung ating norepinephrine, it will be released in the synapse. In the space, it can be synaptic cleft, or kung muscle naman siya, it can be termed as a junction, the neuromuscular junction. So anong tawag natin dito sa sa receptors that are found in the smooth muscle?
What? Adrenergic receptors po daw?
Okay. So adrenergic, no, yung ating alpha 1, alpha 2, beta 1, beta 2. So they are collectively known as adrenergic receptors. So yung sa parasympathetic naman, our
Cholinergic po daw.
so that is known as our cholinergic receptors. Yung ating M at saka N, muscarinic and nicotinic. So we have also here another illustration of our sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. So as you can see here, yung ating the neurons or the sympathetic nervous system comes from the thoracolumbar portion of our spinal cord, and it will the nerves no coming from this segment or the neurons coming from this segment will be able to innervate different types of tissues, no, such as the the iris of the eyes. We also have the salivary gland, the heart, the blood vessels. We have the large blood vessels and the uh, arterioles. We also have the gut, no, particularly the stomach, as well as the pylorus of the stomach. We also have, it will also innervate the liver and also no, the urinary bladder. Aside from that, no, the sympathetic ganglia will also innervate our adrenal gland, no, particularly the adrenal medulla. So in this figure, it will uh, act no, on this particular the cells in the adrenal medulla to release the hormone epinephrine. So when the sympathetic nervous system will innervate the urinary bladder, it will cause the contraction of the urinary bladder. So in the case of the gut, no, particularly the stomach, and particularly also the pylorus of the stomach, it will reduce the peristalsis as well as the secretion in the stomach. For the blood vessels, it will result to vasoconstriction. For the heart, no, it will result to increase in the stroke volume and the heart rate. For the salivary gland, no, it will cause the reduction in the salivary production. And for the eyes, no, it will cause the mydriasis, particularly on the pupil. No, it will cause the mydriasis. What do we mean by mydriasis?
Yung dilation po ng dilation po ng pupil.
Okay. So makikita niyo naman dito na yung black ng mata, it it widens during a sympathetic response or a fight or flight response. So there is mydriasis or pupillary dilation. So that is the opposite when you have parasympathetic stimulation, because in parasympathetic stimulation there is uh, constriction of the pupil, and that is known as meiosis. So during a fight or flight response, during an emergency situation, of course, no, the heart rate increases, the respiration increases, there is a reduction in the salivary flow, there is a reduction also in digestion, in peristalsis, as well as the secretion of the different gastric enzymes or gastric juices. And also, you don't feel to urinate, no, so that there is the inhibition of contraction of the bladder. So meron pala dito ang ano, sa lungs, it will induce the bronchodilation. For the synthesis of catecholamines or catecholamines, so when we say catecholamines, this is any group of amines. When we say amines, these are nitrogen-containing compounds that are derived from the amino acid tyrosine. And it also contains the catechol group. Catechol group. That is the aromatic chemical compound consisting of a benzene ring with two hydroxyl groups. So kaya tinawag siya na catecholamines because it is composed of an amine and a catechol group. So the catecholamines are important as neurotransmitters and hormones. So they can serve as either a neurotransmitter in the CNS and a hormone in the endocrine system. The most abundant catecholamines that is found in the body are epinephrine, norepinephrine, and dopamine. So epinephrine, again, it is also known as adrenaline. It can also be abbreviated as EPI or epi. Norepinephrine is also known as noradrenaline. It can also be abbreviated as NE or NA. And we also have dopamine. Yung mga neurotransmitters, or they are collectively known as catecholamines. So they are catecholamines as hormone are released by the adrenal glands in situations of stress, such as psychological stress or low blood sugar levels. So these are the two stimuli or the two factors that will initiate the production of catecholamines from the adrenal medulla. Number one is the stress, and number two is the low blood sugar levels or hypoglycemia. So this is the structure of the main catecholamines occurring in mammals. The figure here is known as phenylethylamine, and that is the parent compound of the catecholamines. The structure on the left is also known as the catechol group. It is composed of an aromatic ring that is composed of 6 carbon and 2 hydroxyl group attached into it. So the numbers indicate the carbons in the ring. So there are six carbons in the ring or the benzene ring. And the letters identify the carbons in the side chain. So European literature uses the names adrenaline and noradrenaline, while in the American literature we usually use the epinephrine and norepinephrine. So these are the structures of dopamine, noradrenaline or norepinephrine, and the adrenaline or epinephrine. So the cells of the adrenal medulla that synthesize catecholamines are classified as chromaffin cells. So acetylcholine release from the preganglionic nerve fibers initiates the synthesis of the catecholamines by the medullary cells. So acetylcholine is a neurotransmitter that is released by the preganglionic nerve fibers of the sympathetic nervous system, and it will act on the medullary cells in order to initiate the synthesis of catecholamines, the norepinephrine and epinephrine. So acetylcholine also stimulates the release of catecholamines from chromaffin granules. And this phenomenon, the process whereby the catecholamines are released from the chromaffin granules of the adrenal medulla is known as the stimulus secretion coupling. So this is the structure of the chromaffin cells. So saan natin ito matatagpuan yung ating chromaffin cells? They are found within the adrenal medulla, no? Or the medullary cells of the adrenal medulla. We also have here our sympathetic neuron. So this sympathetic neuron is it's also known as the presynaptic or the uh, preganglionic neuron. So in the figure, we have here, ito yung ating neuron sa left, and ito naman yung ating cell membrane. Our cell here is the chromaffin cell in the adrenal medulla. So the letter A here represents the letter A, our neurotransmitter acetylcholine, and our R here represents the receptor for acetylcholine, which is the nicotinic receptor, or which is a cholinergic receptor. So when acetylcholine will bind to its receptor that is located on the cell membrane of the chromaffin cell, it will stimulate the chromaffin cells, particularly the ER, the mitochondria, and we also have here a channel to induce the release of calcium from these structures. Calcium ions from the ER, from the mitochondria, as well as from the outside of the cell. So it will induce the release of calcium, and this calcium will be important for the release of catecholamines that are present within these structures. So these structures are known as, ano yung tawag dyan? Mga bilog-bilog. They are known as chromaffin granules. Now, and these granules contain the catecholamines, the epinephrine and norepinephrine. So when the calcium will be present in the cytosol, it will initiate the release of catecholamines from the chromaffin granules towards to be secreted to the outside of the cell by way of exocytosis. So that is that process wherein the chromaffin granules, upon the release of the calcium from the inside and the outside of the cell, it will activate yung chromaffin granules to release the catecholamines through the process of exocytosis. That process is known as the stimulus secretion coupling. Okay, we also have here a more detailed presentation of how the stimulus secretion coupling will happen. So we have here our neurotransmitter that comes from the presynaptic nerve. And that presynaptic nerve is a splanchnic nerve. Splanchnic nerve because, as we all know, yung ating adrenal gland is located at this splanch region. So mag-enervate sa ating adrenal gland would be the splanchnic nerve. So when the splanchnic nerve will release the neurotransmitter acetylcholine, it will act on the nicotinic acetylcholine receptor and AChR to induce the depolarization of the membrane, to initiate an action potential so that the VOCC, or the voltage operated calcium channel, will open. When this channel will open, it will induce the entry of calcium ions from the outside of the cell to the inside. And these calcium ions are important to stimulate the chromaffin cells or the chromaffin granules to release yung ating mga catecholamines through the process of exocytosis. So when this will happen, it will now release the catecholamines, adrenaline, and the epinephrine to the outside of the cell. And these neurotransmitters can now act on the target tissue or the effector organ to be able to produce its biological activity on these tissues. Naintindihan ba yun? Kaya na yun? So that is the process now of the stimulus secretion coupling, or the process whereby catecholamines are released from our chromaffin granules in the adrenal medulla. So the synthesis of the catecholamines begins with either of the amino acid phenylalanine or tyrosine. However, tyrosine is a naturally occurring amino acid, and most synthesis of catecholamines begins with it, tyrosine. So this is the pathway whereby catecholamine synthesis happens in the adrenal medulla. So it all starts with tyrosine. Tyrosine is considered to be it is a non-essential amino acid. There are two types of amino acid. We have the essential and the non-essential. Because tyrosine is readily available in the body, so the most common pathway whereby catecholamines are generated is by the amino acid tyrosine. So tyrosine in this pathway will be acted upon by a specific enzyme known as the thyroxine hydroxylase, and it will produce the compound DOPA. So DOPA will be acted upon by another enzyme, which is known as the AAAD, to produce dopamine, and dopamine will be acted upon by another enzyme to produce norepinephrine, and norepinephrine will later produce epinephrine through the action of the enzyme PNMT, or the phenylethylamine and methyltransferase. So in your figure here, you can see the shaded area, and the shaded area here represents the structural changes that occur at each step. So for example, from this one to this one, we have here the attachment or the addition of the hydroxyl group at this particular carbon of our catechol ring through the action of this enzyme known as the tyrosine hydroxylase. So pag sinabi nating hydroxylase, that is an enzyme that will add a hydroxyl group to our compound. We also have here another enzyme, the AAAD. The D stands for decarboxylase. So pag sinabi nating decarboxylase, it will remove a carboxyl group in one of our compounds. So in this case, the carboxyl group here in the DOPA will be removed to produce the compound dopamine. The same is true for the production of norepinephrine. So again, it will also be acted upon by a hydroxylase. So when we say hydroxylase, that is an enzyme that will add a hydroxyl group to this particular compound, to norepinephrine, to produce norepinephrine. And another, after the production of norepinephrine, it will again acted upon by this particular enzyme to produce epinephrine. So in this figure, you can see here the regulation of the catecholamine synthesis in the adrenal medulla. So the minus sign represents the inhibition, and the plus sign here represents the stimulation. So in this figure, you can see that the production of norepinephrine from dopamine will be will take place in the norepinephrine granule, and the production of epinephrine will always take place in the epinephrine granules. So yung pag-produce ng norepinephrine, it takes place at a separate site from that of the epinephrine. So they are not produced at the same granule. No? So yung ating norepinephrine granule, it is a separate entity from our epinephrine granule. So for example, when dopamine will be formed, so for dopamine to be able to be converted into norepinephrine, it must first be transported, and the dopamine must first be transported into the granule, the NE granule, for it to be able to be converted to norepinephrine. So, and norepinephrine, since it is not the end pathway for our catecholamines, so yung norepinephrine, it can still produce epinephrine. So the conversion of norepinephrine to epinephrine can, in this figure, can take place in the cytosol. So this is the cytosol of the cell, the chromaffin cell. And one of the factors here that is important for the conversion of norepinephrine to epinephrine, aside from PNMT, is the hormone, cortisol, which is produced by the adrenal cortex. So it is also, cortisol is also important in the conversion of norepinephrine to epinephrine. So what are the actions of catecholamines? So the actions of the catecholamines involve the regulation of the intermediary metabolism, as well as responses that allow animals to adjust to situations involving acute stress. So yung catecholamines, they are important in order for the animal to adapt to certain type of stress or threatening event in the body. And it is also very important in intermediary metabolism, or the metabolism of important compounds in the body, such as the carbohydrates, the fats or the lipids, and the protein. So its actions are mediated through adrenergic receptors that are located on target tissues. So when we are going to have an organization of our sympathetic nervous system. So the sympathetic nervous system is basically composed of a preganglionic neuron and the postganglionic neuron. So the neurotransmitters or the hormones that are released in the preganglionic neuron of the sympathetic nerve is always acetylcholine. The same is true for the parasympathetic. For the postganglionic nerve or the postganglionic neuron of our sympathetic nervous system, it always releases the neurotransmitter norepinephrine, to act on the different tissues or target organs in the body, such as the salivary gland, the pupil, the the lungs or the bronchi, the heart, and the gut, or the stomach, the intestine, and the liver. So again, no, yung ating blue here represents our preganglionic nerve. The red one here represents our postganglionic nerve. And the hormone or the neurotransmitter that are released by this preganglionic nerve is acetylcholine, while the hormone that is released by our postganglionic nerve under the sympathetic nervous system is the norepinephrine, with the exception of the sweat glands, because in the sweat glands, innervation of the sympathetic nervous system the innervation is through the muscarinic receptor, which is under the parasympathetic naman. And that innervation will release the acetylcholine neurotransmitter. So this is a simplified version of our preganglionic neuron or the presynaptic neuron and our postsynaptic neuron or the postganglionic neuron of our sympathetic and the parasympathetic. So for the autonomic nervous system, they are always composed of these two, the pre and the postganglionic neuron. The preganglionic neuron is attached to the postganglionic neuron by way of the autonomic ganglia. And the postganglionic neuron will be the one to innervate the different effector organs, including the cardiac muscle, the smooth muscle, the glands, and the adipose tissue, not to name a few. So this portion here represents the CNS, and this portion here represents the PNS, or the peripheral nervous system. Of course, we have here the attachment between these two neurons represents the synapse or the synapses. And at this synapses, the neurotransmitters will be able to act on different receptors. So pag sympathetic, it will act on the adrenergic receptors at this particular neuron. The same is true for these effector organs. So it will also act, the neurotransmitters that are released here will act on the adrenergic receptors. At this portion, all the preganglionic neuron will release the acetylcholine, so they will act on cholinergic receptors such as muscarinic receptors. So the preganglionic neuron is its cell body is located in the brain or spinal cord, and its axon extends to the autonomic ganglion. So ito yung ating autonomic ganglion. That is the termination of our preganglionic neuron. This is our spinal cord. In the spinal cord, this is where the preganglionic neuron originates, and it terminates on the autonomic ganglion. Then after the autonomic ganglion, we have the postganglionic neuron. The cell body of the postganglionic neuron lies outside the CNS, particularly in the autonomic ganglia. The axon terminates in the visceral effector. So in this case, The effectors here, is represented by the bronchi and the smooth muscle. So for the sympathetic nervous system, it will release the hormone NE, norepinephrine. For the parasympathetic naman, it will release the acetylcholine or the ACH. So this is another representation of our, um, so this one here is our sympathetic. This one here is also our sympathetic. So at this portion, we have here the adrenal gland, particularly the adrenal medulla, and it will again be innervated by the sympathetic preganglionic neuron, which is myelinated. This particular nerve is also known as the splanchnic nerve. It will innervate this uh, the medullary cells of the adrenal medulla. So when, for example, acetylcholine will be released to act on the medullary cells, it will initiate the stimulus secretion coupling, wherein the catecholamines, norepinephrine, will be released from the chromaffin granules of the chromaffin cell. So after the NE will be released from the chromaffin granules, it will now be able to act on its target tissue. So in this case, we have the blood vessel. So it will act on the adrenergic receptors that is located in the blood vessel to, for example, to induce vasoconstriction in the blood vessel. So pareho lang ito, no? So all the preganglionic neuron of the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system will release the acetylcholine, while for the postganglionic neuron, for the parasympathetic, it will release the acetylcholine. For the sympathetic, it will release the NE and the epi, except for the sweat glands, wherein it will release the acetylcholine. So as you can notice here, and we are going to compare, iba-iba yung length ng kanyang pre at saka post ganglionic neuron. So we also have here another representation of the different actions of the sympathetic nervous system to the different effector organs. So in the pupil, it will induce mydriasis. So upon so again, the red circles here represents the NE, or the norepinephrine that is released from the postganglionic neuron of the sympathetic nerves. So when NE will be secreted, it will be released to act on the adrenergic receptors in the pupil to induce mydriasis or dilation of the pupil. It will act on the salivary gland to decrease salivation. It will act on the bronchi to induce dilation. It will act on the heart to induce increase in the heart rate. And it will act on the stomach, the GIT, to decrease digestion. So in the bladder, it will contract the bladder to decrease urination. Our splanchnic nerve here will also act on our adrenal gland to release NE and epinephrine. But majority of the neurotransmitters or hormone or catecholamine that is released by the adrenal gland is the norepinephrine. By the adrenergic receptors, so there are two major types of adrenergic receptors. We have the alpha and beta. So for the alpha, it can be subdivided into alpha 1, alpha 2. For the beta, we have three. No, the beta 1, beta 2, and beta 3. So for the alpha adrenergic receptors, they control catecholamine release from sympathetic nerve endings, with alpha 1 affecting postsynaptic nerve endings, and alpha 2 affecting presynaptic terminals. For the beta 1, for the beta receptors, for the beta 1 receptors, they will mainly act on the heart. For the beta 2 receptors, they will affect mainly the smooth muscle contraction and intermediary metabolism. So when we say intermediary metabolism, that is the metabolism of our uh, carbohydrates, the fats, and the proteins. This is a summary of the different adrenergic receptors. So alpha 1, alpha 2, beta 1, and beta 2. So for alpha 1, for example, uh, it will act now mainly on the blood vessels. They are mostly inhibitory in nature. The same is true for the alpha 2 receptor. So uh, alpha 2 receptors are basically inhibitory in nature because it will inhibit the release of catecholamines from the presynaptic and the postsynaptic nerve endings. For the beta 1 receptors, so they will mainly act on the heart. It will increase the all parameters in the heart as well as the kidney. For the beta 2 receptors, they will mainly act on the lungs not to induce bronchodilation. So we'll continue this next meeting.